He estimated $600 billion per year tariff revenues, and he wants to use that to offset the tax cut that he's going to extend. And that would usually cost about $400 billion per year. So his calculation is we can use the tariff revenues to pay for the tax cuts. And we can talk about, again, the wishful thinking behind this. Objectives. And then, so going back to this idea of, reindustrialization, I think you're absolutely right. Tariff could be used as a tool, right, for a very specific time period to protect certain infant industry. And that's what the United States did. That's what China has done. And that's many developing countries have been doing. The difficulty, the problem now is, I think, for Trump is there's no real plan to really have a holistic sort of industrial policy or programs, right, to really reindustrialize the United States economy.
Hello and welcome to a new podcast from the Belt and Road Institute in Sweden. My name is Hussein Askari. Today is Thursday, April the 3rd. President Trump last night, while everybody was asleep, he had slapped tariffs on the whole planet, practically. This was anticipated in a way, but what President Trump has presented was completely absurd and surrealistic. And there was shock all over the world, starting in Asia, but also here in Europe. And then later, the shock reached the United States. As we are speaking right now, the U.S. Markets are going down, like the Dow Jones by 3.7%, the NASDAQ by 5.7%. Some of the high-tech companies in the United States, like Apple and Nvidia and others, lost hundreds of billions of dollars of value. So I don't consider personally stock markets as a marker of economic development, but President Trump himself was bragging that since he was elected, the stock markets were going up, which is a sign of his sound economic policy. But since he was inaugurated, the U.S. stock markets have declined, and even the U.S. dollar. So anyway, this is today is the big story. Now, as a person who has worked also on West Asia, the Middle East, and U.S. policy there, I'm a bit worried that in the middle of this chaotic situation created by the President of the United States, and actually that did not get the euphoria and the great results for the American economy, and now everybody's talking about recession, that in the middle of this chaos, somebody might start a new war in the Middle East. Right now, for the past 2 weeks, the United States have been building up a massive air power, and there are threats against Iran. Also, we have the situation in Gaza now reaching a disastrous situation since the Israeli government violated the ceasefire and stopped the prisoners exchange and imposed a total blockade on the people of Gaza. Now, starvation is setting in. Today, we got the news that all the bakeries in the Gaza Strip were closed, and there will be a famine. And while everybody's watching the situation in the United States, some very bad things could happen in the Middle East, West Asia, in this context. So anyway, this is just something on the side that people have to keep in mind, that somebody might try to divert the attention from the chaotic economic situation created by Trump's policy into creating a crisis somewhere else to divert the attention. But our subject today is on the tariffs and also their impact on the U.S. economy and the global economy. And to discuss this, we are very happy and honored to have with us from Oregon, the United States, West Coast, Pacific Coast, Professor Yan Liang. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I have been watching a lot of your shows and I enjoy all of them. And I also really like what you said at the top, right? So we're in this very tumultuous times and I think developing countries are really struggling already. But now I think with this tariff blow, it is going to also affect, the developing world. Not to mention these war-torn countries. I think they would have an even harder time, right, to cope with the already very difficult situation on the ground. So, well,
Right.
thank you for inviting me, and I really look forward to sort of discussions with you about, how we're navigating through this chaos.
Yeah, well, it's very important that you are with us today. You are a professor of economics at the Willamette University in Oregon, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Global Development Policy at Boston University. You have recently written a paper on the finance, or working on a paper on financial sustainability, but also you have also already written papers on China's economic activities in Africa and cooperation with Africa. Today, as we had agreed earlier that we were supposed to speak for half of our show on the tariffs policy and their impact on the US and global economy and China on the Belt and Road. And then the second part would be about what we call financial sustainability, the question of uh, financing infrastructure along the Belt and Road, especially in Africa and in Asia, and also the question of the debt trap, which you are doing a lot of research on. We have also done research. But today, because of the situation with the tariffs and the economic, global economic situation, we will dedicate today's show to discuss the tariffs and their impact and the situation surrounding them. And we promise our viewers to have a second interview and show on the question of the Belt and Road financing infrastructure specifically, because it's a very, very important issue. So today we will talk about you being in the United States is very important. I would like to ask you about your impressions, the people around you, how you see this thing. But I can tell you what we have experienced today in Sweden, where I am now, and in the EU, because we had a panic situation actually. The leader of Sweden, the prime minister, made a press conference this morning. The leader of the EU, Mrs. Von der Leyen, and every head of state in Europe was on the TV screens this morning, talking about what to do about this shocking news about the new tariffs. Now, in Sweden, for example, the shock is very large because the United States is the third largest trade partner of Sweden. It's the third largest export market after Germany, which is already in trouble, and Norway. And the United States is number 3. We export 3 times more to the United States than we import. We export cars, automobile parts, and other machinery and high-tech products. China for example, is number 11. So for Sweden, the United States is very, very important. And also the same is for many countries in Europe. Now, some people are talking already that some of the industries, like the Volvo cars, which is, by the way, owned by Chinese Geely, they might have to relocate some of their production from Sweden to the United States. So this is creating an enormous turbulent situation and chaos in the whole world. But I mean, there was on a comic side of this, there was I didn't know that President Trump has also slapped sanctions on the islands of Bird and McDonald. Now, these are islands just north of Antarctica. They are populated by penguins and seals and some sheep. Even they did not survive this. We don't know how the penguins will retaliate against this, but this is so absurd and surrealistic. It's incredible, but this is a reality. It's a very real story. So please let us know what your impression is seeing what has happened today.
Yeah, I think you are right. I think, this sort of the so-called Liberation Day announcements is pretty much throw the whole world in a, tailspin. I think every country, consumers, politicians, businesses are like, they're all trying to think about, first of all, what's the rationale of doing all this, right? That creates so much economic sort of dislocation everywhere. And then what would be the reactions of all the different countries, and then what would be the impact going forward? So maybe let me just very quickly go through the first question about the rationale. So if you look at the table with this tariff announcement, it's quite clear. I think many of the specialists were really shocked when they really find out how the so-called, the tariffs that other countries charge the United States is computed, right? So the USTR, the trade representative, they're basically saying, well, we need to calculate all the tariffs and also the non-tariff trade barriers like, quota or currency manipulations or any numbers of barriers to be able to come up with, this tariff rate that the US will reciprocate with. The problem is when you really look at those numbers, they said China charges the US 67%. They say Vietnam charges the US 90%, and South Africa charges the US 60%. So you really start to scratch your head. And Thailand, by the way, charge the US 72%. So you really scratch your head and say, where do those numbers come from? So, as it turned out, the way that these rates are calculated is very simple. They're basically taking the trade balance, right? So between the US and this other country, and divide that by the US's imports of, the products from that country, right? So take China example. China's trade, surplus, in other words, the US's trade deficit with China is about $295 billion. Okay. And the US's imports from China was about $438 billion. So when you do the ratio, it came out exactly as 67%. So many of the experts have already run the numbers, and I personally have done a few, and that is exactly right, right? And then the USTR, actually the press secretary of the White House came out this morning on Twitter and say, here's the formula we use. And that is precisely the way to simplify it is to take the trade balance, divide that by the US's imports from that country. So it's very kind of arbitrary and also laughable because the assumption here is that the reason that the US is incurring a trade deficit with another country is because this other country have too high tariffs against the US's products. But we know
Which is
this is
not true,
which
as
is a
we discussed.
completely false assumption if you ask any economists, right?
And
There's
it
so many.
looks like the Trump administration is trying to punish everybody because they have a surplus in their trade with the United States.
Exactly. The US is running a trade deficit with over 100 countries in the world. And for those countries that actually are running a trade deficit against the US, in other words, the US is in a sort of favorable surplus position, those countries are still being charged 10%. So Singapore, Australia, those are the countries that are still having 10% of tariff, even though they're running a surplus with the US. So you're right. In a way, the US wants to tariff everyone, right? Wage a trade war with every country in the world. And I really, really wanted to also highlight, you said, it's kind of funny in the way that the Trump wants to tariff the seals and then the penguins. But when you look at also numbers like the way they're going to tariff countries like Myanmar, which just suffered a 7.9 degree of devastating earthquake that desperately needs some economic relief, they are going to impose a tariff rate of 44%, right? Let that be clear. 44% of tariff that are imposed in Myanmar. For countries like Sri Lanka, which is already struggle with debt crises, another 44% that is being imposed by the United States, right? So this is not only absurd to say that these countries are running a very small trade surplus with the United States, the US needs to tariff them, but it's also morally very, very repugnant, right? I mean, these are the countries that would need to be able to, right, to generate some export revenues so that they can buy really important, imports, food and energy and things that they desperately need at this point. And yet the United States basically saying, no, we're not going to allow you to to export to our country, right? Not allowing you to earn foreign, exchanges. So I think this is really, I think both from economic point of view and also just from an ethical, moral point of view, this sort of so-called liberation, it's really waging a war against the entire world,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
Yeah,
There's another category because the countries neighboring China, and also these are mostly the ASEAN countries. They are also the worst hit in the, like, Cambodia, Vietnam, Thailand, even Taiwan, uh,
yes,
Malaysia, Indonesia. These countries also have become a safe haven for American producers who were fleeing China because of the tariffs imposed the last time, and now they are being punished uh,
right.
as, uh, because the issue is that the last time the tariffs didn't work because many of these countries were importing Chinese intermediate products, including Mexico and others, to produce the goods they export to the United States. So they're being punished again because they still dependent on China and dealing with China for their economic productivity. So this is another level of war against those countries.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think these are the countries that also run trade surplus with the United States. And so that, is benefited from some of the trade diversions from China or FDI diversions from China. And so they're being tariffed very heavily. Like you said, Vietnam is 46%. But even for countries like South Korea, Japan, and India, right, they are tariffed at 24%, 25%, 26% respectively. So again, the idea that Donald Trump has is very simple. He cares about the bilateral trade balance. He thinks that, if he is going to a store and he buys from the store has a, surplus and he has a deficit, then this is unfair for him, right? So, this is a very, I would say, laughable idea. If you ask any economist, right, trade, it does not work that way. You're getting the real goods and services, and you're paying just a fiat currency. So it's not really a cost, so to speak, for the United States. And even if you don't like deficit for varieties of reasons, right, we could talk about the job impacts and all that. Still, this is not because the countries are manipulative, right? Or they're charging high tariffs and whatnot to be able to sort of take advantage of the United States. That is a completely a false, very deceptive accusation on the part of the United States.
Yeah, we would like to talk about the economics of this situation because whatever the president and his advisor are thinking about is not really coherent with reality. It's like he's talking about the golden age for the U.S. Manufacturing and stuff, but there was a golden age in the U.S. history at the end of the 19th century when the United States became increasingly an industrial power in the world. But it was competing with the British Empire, with other European empires, and they protected their nascent infant industries by imposing tariffs, which was completely legitimate at the time. The British Empire is not a nice guy you can deal with. But that was a golden age, today the global supply chains and the global trade is so entangled, is it almost impossible. Now, the question is, if you don't have the capacity to produce the goods you are claiming, you want to put tariffs on so you can produce them at home, but can the United States produce these goods at home? For many, many decades, the United States have been outsourcing production of goods and getting them for a very affordable price from outside, giving people dollars, which are printed. So the United States was in doing well, and the consumers were getting cheap products. But at the same time, the United States was not investing in infrastructure, was not investing in manufacturing, was not investing in science and technology, except for certain sectors. It was mostly military, industrial sectors and related areas. But also the United States is not does not have the capacity to produce all these goods. So what is the rationale? How would Trump says all these industries should come back to the United States, but where should they go? They said if you don't have the infrastructure, if you don't have the skilled labor, if you don't have the supply chain system what you have in China, then how could you repatriate all this industry? It doesn't make sense, does it?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When it comes to really the objectives, I would say this idea of a reindustrialize the US is one of the objectives. And we will focus on this one for now. But there are other objectives I think Trump wants to achieve with tariff, and you can clearly see how contradictory some of these objectives are. So one of them, of course, is Trump has been touted that, tariff is paid by the foreigners, and this is going to raise, tax revenues or tariff revenues for the United States. He estimated $600 billion per year tariff revenues, and he wants to use that to offset the tax cut that he's going to extend. And that would usually cost about $400 billion per year. So his calculation is we can use the tariff revenues to pay for the tax cuts. And we can talk about, again, the wishful thinking behind this. And then second is he's also thinking to use the tariff as a way to reduce the trade deficit. And so again, we can think about and that's sort of connected to this question about reindustrialization, right? Can the United States really made everything domestically, right, to replace the imports. And then finally, I think he's also trying to use tariff as a leverage to get other non-economic objectives or economic objectives for the matter, right? So he, for example, earlier was saying that he's going to charge Colombia 25% tariff if Colombia does not receive the deportees back. And he's also saying charging, the BRICS countries 100% tariff if they wanted to, diversify away from the dollar. He's also talking about Russia, that he's going to increase tariff if Russia does not comply with the peace deal, and also definitely tax Finland or others if they're not making concessions on, Greenland or China if they don't, allow for divestment of TikTok and so on and so forth. So he's also thinking about use tariff as a tool, right, to achieve other objectives. So going back to this idea of, reindustrialization, I think you're absolutely right. Tariff could be used as a tool, right, for a very specific time period to protect certain infant industry. And that's what the United States did. That's what China has done. And that's many developing countries have been doing. The difficulty, the problem now is, I think, for Trump is there's no real plan to really have a holistic sort of industrial policy or programs, right, to really reindustrialize the United States economy. The US's manufacturing now is about 10%, 11% of the GDP, and its employment is about 9% of the GDP. So we know the US has been transitioning away from manufacturing, since 5 decades, 6 decades ago, right? And the US economy is also highly financialized. And the lack of investment, like you said, in infrastructure. The US's infrastructure is rated at C minus, according to the Civil Engineering Society. Not enough skilled workforce, as you also pointed out, especially with Trump's idea of mass deportation of immigrant workers, undocumented immigrants, right? So that is, again, going to affect the labor force. And like you also said, the Trump administration now has rescinded the Inflation Reduction Act, the Science and Chips Act, the Chips and Science Act, also slash funding for NIH, for NSF, the National Science Foundation, slash the budgets for the national the education department, federal level, so on and so forth. So everything is going against this idea that we wanted to improve the US's productive capacity. Now, Trump has this idea that as long as we put the tariff up, then foreign companies will come in and build the factories here, right? But I think, again, there are a couple problems with that. One is we already said there's not enough incentives for foreigners to really genuinely open stores here. And even they do, it takes them years, if not longer, to get things out of the ground and really keep things moving. But Trump's is going to be in office for what, 3+ years, right? There's so much policy uncertainty, whether or not the tariff is going to stay forever, whether or not there will be further cuts in federal programs and, incentives and so on and so forth. It makes the businesses very difficult to think about long-term planning. And last but not the least, I think this is also often ignored, which is the idea that, well, as long as we can keep those imports at bay, then somehow domestic producers are going to increase the production, which I think, again, cannot be further from the reality. The reality is, if you set up the tariffs, protect the domestic market for the domestic producers, take auto as example, right? If they're able to enjoy the high auto prices at the low production scale and enjoy that handsome profits, right? There's no reason for these automakers to say, oh, let's increase production, let's drop the price, right? And we made more profits that way. There's no reason for them to do that. They're more than happy to enjoy the monopolistic position in the domestic market, right? Not to mention, again, looking at the auto industries, yes, they're faced very fierce foreign competition, but at the same time, these auto companies are simply not in the interest of engaging in the real innovations, real production, and really sort of engage in production and trade. What they are interested in doing instead is really the so-called maximizing shareholder values in the short term. Use stock buyback dividend payouts to beef up their share prices and enjoy the profits that way. Last year, the big auto companies in the US spent $6 billion for stock buybacks. Now, the $6 billion could be used for reinvestment, right? And expand workforce and build more better cars in the United States. They didn't do that. Boeing, last 10 years, spent $68 billion, right? Let that sink in. $68 billion on stock buyback. They could have increased their innovation. They could improve, the way they make
Right.
airplanes so that airplanes don't just, fall out of the sky. They didn't do that. So I think there are just a lot of these, I would say, complications when you think about how to reindustrialize the US economy. Should the US do that? Maybe, for certain reasons. We may or may not go into it today. Maybe they do want to reindustrialize a little bit. Maybe they do want to, move away from financialization a little bit for their own good sake, right? But can tariff deliver all these, outcomes? Not at all. So I think that is the key.
Well, that was a very, very important point, actually, that fact that the enormous wealth which was generated by globalization, by these American multinational companies who were importing goods from all over the world and selling in the United States, that the benefits of that trade were never reinvested in the American economy. So you have a very small portion of the American population got extremely wealthy, and the rest were, going backwards. Especially the working class. So there are two issues which I want to talk about. Is that the fact that the other countries might have, especially China, have alternatives which the United States doesn't have, both in terms of markets, but also in terms of capacity and economic partners to replace the United States as a market. But it's interesting that, as you also had written recently, I also wrote an article that I was looking at who was protesting most and who would be hurt most by these tariffs, that it is the American consumer, but also there are productive sectors in the United States will be extremely hurt by this, especially the farmers who have a great deal of their export market in China. And now if China, retaliates by stopping the importing the soybeans, beef, and others from the U.S. market, farmers in the United States lost enormous. Like the last time there was this war, they lost around $27 billion because the China could go and import the same products from Brazil or Argentina. So China has an alternative to import that. You have the agricultural machinery company, John Deere, which both is affected by the American farmers losing the market, but also their market, share internationally because China can produce agricultural machinery at a very high, sophisticated level. So they no longer need John Deere, although it's a very good brand and very, still popular in China. But China has alternatives, but the United States doesn't have. Now we have also the question that because the United States is waging a war against the whole world, so the whole world will react collectively against the United States. We have the For example, we have the area, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China and all ASEAN countries who were punished, we've mentioned, plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. They share 1/3 of the global GDP, 1/3 of the world population, and the enormous industrial technological capacity. They are all in one free trade area. So they can still manage, to build. But if the United States builds a fence around itself, including against the EU, closest partners, the United States doesn't have an alternative, neither as a production capacity nor as a market, which China has, other nations might have. Now we have a discussion in Europe already today. I saw one of the prominent German industrial, figures. He was talking about that the EU must reorient now as quickly as possible towards China, lift some of the tariffs against China, and also go back to the comprehensive, agreement on investments, which was stopped 3 years ago. So even the EU is looking for alternatives, and China, of course, has the whole global South to deal with. So, in your view, who will be hurt most from these tariffs?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we know for sure tariff and retaliation for that matter are going to produce a lose-lose situation. So the best way, it's not to have a war in the first place. But of course, Donald Trump decided to do that anyway. Now, the US, of course, like you said, it will be hurt. In terms of the tariff, it has a very high pass-through effect. In fact, some of the economists have done the estimation, right? So the impact of tariff is going to be predominantly passed on to the prices. So about 94% of the pass-through rate. So if you have a 10% increase in tariff, about 9.4, 9.5% will be passed on to the higher prices, which means the U.S. consumers are going to bear the brunt. And so now with the Chinese tariff, the 20% that they had earlier and then now 34%. So the tariff rate is increased by 54%. And so you could imagine, the US is importing $400 billion per year from China. And so that 54% of tariff is going to increase the products substantially, right? So when it comes to consumer electronics, Apple phones, when it comes to many of the household appliances, toys as well, and many of these things will likely to see price go up very quickly. And then not to mention, all those tariffs on the automobiles, steel, aluminum, and now with Mexico and Canada. Remember, they still had the earlier 25% tariff rate because of the fentanyl issue. And so all of these are going to add up, and it's going to cost U.S. consumers, at least $3,000, $4,000 more per year. Just a rough calculation, 25% on average now with the U.S.'s tariff on, all the imports. So this is going to be costing tremendously for especially low-income families, right? So because that's another $3,000, $4,000 that they have to spend on their groceries, on their home appliances, on any numbers of products that they are buying, not only from abroad, but also from home, because all these tariffs are going to affect the imported parts and components. So even if a lot of products are made in the United States, they are still using foreign components and parts. So the price would still go up for those products. Okay, so I think, yes, that's going to raise inflation rate. And again, now I think many economists are still calculating how much exactly the inflation rate is going to go up. My back of the envelope, I think, sort of calculation is we're very likely to see the inflation rate go up by 3.5, 3.6% this year, as compared to without the tariff is probably 2.5%, according to the Federal Reserve's projection. So it's a very substantial amount when you think about it. And then when it comes to others, when it comes to, for example, jobs and employment, economy. So all of this is going to be affected in a negative way, right? Because again, even if you're able to increase home production, it's going to take time. Not to mention, we just talked about all the reasons why it's not likely to increase domestic production and employment, for even the medium term. If we look at the first term of Trump's tariff war, we clearly see how things worked out. So, for example, Trump's tariff on the wash machines from South Korea, it did create a couple, a few thousand jobs, but each of the job is come at about $800,000 price tag, meaning the consumers are paying, 800,000 for each of the job that is being created. And this is the finished product. But if you look at the intermediate goods like steel, right, that is even worse because, the steel tariff pretty much raised the steel price by 2% and increased domestic production of steel by 2%. So that creates about 1,000 steel sector jobs. But that is at the expense of about 75,000 jobs in the steel using industries. So the downstream industries, automobile sector, home appliances, whatever the sector that uses steel a lot, will see job losses. So on the net, you're losing jobs. And so when you look at the Federal Reserve Board's 2024 paper, and they show that Trump 1.0's tariff war pretty much reduced the manufacturing jobs by 2.7% on the net. So again, this is not going to work for the US's economy, period, right? Now, for the rest of the world, I would also say it does create a lot of ripple effects. Now, I agree with you that countries would likely to trade more with each other, right? Because the US is no longer a reliable trade partner, and country will try to diversify away from the United States. But that said, I think at least given the current way the global financial system is set up, the United States is a reserve currency issuer. It is the one that enjoyed the privilege, right, exorbitant privilege, to be able to net import, run trade deficit for the past 50 years without necessary adjustments, meaning there's no financial crisis, no currency crisis, no economic recession to force the US to reduce its trade deficit. So the US is a big buyer. So for countries that really rely on external demand, they would have a hard time to find the buyers, the ultimate buyers for their products. But that said, I think, again, you look at China, you look at even Vietnam, you look at Mexico, they all talk about boosting domestic demand, right? This is what, President Xi talked about. We need to increase domestic demand. This is also what you hear from Sheinbaum in Mexico that says we need a comprehensive sort of a response. We need to increase domestic demand. So I think what you're likely to see is if the United States not suffer from a big recession, they will still continue to import. They're just going to import at a higher cost, at a higher prices, right? Because they can't make those things at home. And if the consumers still need to buy them, they will buy from the rest of the world. So we're going to still see one way or the other, the US need to import from other countries. Okay. Now, if the US is going to really suffer, the consumers will say enough is enough. I'm just simply not going to be able to buy, regardless of its imports or domestic products. I just can't afford to buy them anymore. Now, this will reduce consumer spending and, usher in a recession in the United States. This will reduce the US's imports. So then many of the countries that used to be able to export to the United States will now have to, think about how to strengthen their own domestic demand in order to, to boost their own economy. Because again, not all countries can run a surplus. Not all the countries can net exports. And I don't think this is a bad thing. I think if you can boost domestic demand, you enjoy the real goods and services, why not? Right? So I think it does seem to me it is going to be a lose-lose situation, but countries will go through some transition periods and we'll see how things shake out, on the other side. But international trade is going to continue. Countries may trade on a more balanced footing, and they will continue to enjoy the benefits of, division of labor, competitive advantage, better efficiency, better competition, better products, but the US will be left behind.
Yeah. Well, this is important because, we really don't wish the United States to go into a recession or collapse. We wish the United States to be a peaceful nation, a prosperous nation, but there is a need for a shift in the policy from the destructive policy which we have seen in the past years. And because the United States still has certain interesting sectors, which I would end up with discussing. But the whole world will be affected by this. It's not like the United States will be affected or this or that. I mean, today I was listening to the Prime Minister of Canada. I mean, he's a banker. He's not my favorite statesman, but he was talking in such a tone, which was really chilling, because he said, we have had an era, an epoch since the end of World War II. It has ended today. And he was talking like, this like apocalyptic situation we have not only in Canada, but in the whole world. And it is really, really very bad for the whole world economic development. And therefore, it's very, very important, as you say, nations should, accelerate their economic development, their domestic markets. I think the Belt and Road Initiative plays an important role in this. We have discussed this in question of, why China is enhancing the development, enabling the development in Africa. It's now shifting its relationship to like countries in the Gulf, where there's a massive industrialization going on, like in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, in Egypt, and other parts of the world. So there will be a completely new situation, but the EU and the United States can be part of that if they abandon their zero-sum game and geopolitical problems with both China and also, to a certain extent, Russia, because now the EU are left behind in a certain way because they were forced to abandon the cheap energy coming from Russia, and now the United States is abandoning them, and they have no other source for to supply their industries with the cheap energy. So they have to find a new way. So the question here, we are not discussing, if the United States goes down, if this is good for the world. It's not good for the world. We really wish the United States to be part of a better world in this sense. There's a question of reality, the physical reality, and of how the world economy has evolved. In the end of March, the United States also had new special fees on shipping companies that use China manufactured ships, container ships especially. And these are enormous, fines, on ships docking in American ports, like up to $1 million per container ship, which makes things very expensive. Actually, American producers and exporters were protesting most. But the issue is that 90% of the shipping activities is run, to a certain extent through China-built ships, and this is what one of the rules of this new fine is, that even companies, American and international companies who have ordered ships to be built in China in the future, they will also be fined. Now, if you look at I looked at the statistics of the largest shipping companies, the liners, like Maersk Müller, the CMA, CMG, Hapag-Lloyd, they are all ordering their future ships in China. 60, 70, 80, 90% of the future ships will be built in China, because China does have the capacity to do that. The Japan, South Korea, the United States don't. The United States has a fantastic shipyard industry, but it's completely dedicated to warships and aircraft carriers. And so this is something which some of my friends in the United States say, that we should retool the American military industry into civilian industry, because there is still a capacity to do that. So this is a question about physical reality of, like which industrial systems we have in the world, the supply chains. And China has managed to build a complete industrial system and supply chain inside China, with, of course, its extensions globally. But the United States has been losing that. So which areas can the United States still use some of its technological industrial capacities that are still there to rejuvenate its economy? What could the United States do?
Yeah, I think no doubt. I do believe that the United States, is really sort of blessed with all the natural resources and all the resources it needs, right? It used to be also able to attract global talents. It's got, really large amount of natural resources, being, energy or, all kinds of, I would say, sort of natural resources. And so you're right. I think the question here is really about priority. It's really about economic democracy, right? That how do we use the resources for? So the United States, of course, it's been prioritizing the financial industry, the military industrial complex. It has not really used the resources that it has, the technology it has, the talent it has, to, for example, engineer a energy transition. I mean, the United States could totally do that, but they choose not to. So I think you're right. I think physically it is possible, but unfortunately, I don't think this is not this is happening because of the overwhelming, financial interests behind, and also because of the very incompetent, I would say, politicians, very corrupt, political system. If the military industry is going to generate higher profits, if the financial sector, the healthcare sector, the real estate sector are going to generate higher profits, then those are the sectors are going to suck all the capital, the talent, and the policy priorities to them. They're not going to really use the resources to develop industries that would be better to lift the living standards of the general American. So I think yes, physically everything is possible. The U.S. is totally has the resources to do that, but I think it's lacking that political will. It's lacking, that right sort of incentives, right? It lacks the kind of systematic, the structural, factors that would really divert the resources to the more the really to benefit the average Americans. And I would also say, the US again, in this case, the Trump has been playing victim, right? To say that we have been victimized by all these countries, they pillaged us, they ripped us off. But again, this could not be further from truth, right? The corporations, they're earning billions, trillions, from this kind of globalized supply chain, the global markets, and even for American consumers. I mean, in the past 5 decades, they've been enjoying, foreign goods and services. Now, you may say some pockets of the U.S. is losing manufacturing jobs. Well, be that as it may, it has more to do with the structural changes in the economy, post-industrial, service-oriented economy, more financialized economy. And if the government really is determined to do that, they can always help to create more jobs in the economy. So I think it's really the policy incompetence that they're trying to deflect, right? Trying to blame the foreigners for taking away the jobs. But the reality is that they simply fail to cope with the economic transition, the structural changes in the economy, the technological, the automations, and they fail to deliver for the people. And so the easiest way, of course, is to blame the foreigners. So, the downside of this, of course, is we're moving from a very unfavorable neoliberal regime to now even worse system, right? That is basically a jungle. The rule of jungle now applies, right? Whoever has the biggest
Yeah.
fist is gonna have the loudest voice. So I am not nostalgia, of the neoliberal system. I'm actually happy to see, the US, the collective West is kind of falling apart in terms of their unity and alliances. But I am concerned about, what the new system is going to look like, how it's going to replace the current system. So I think the silver lining then at the end of the day is really, you hear this the Spanish prime minister said yesterday after Trump's announced the tariff rate, quote, "We will act swiftly, proportionally, and with unity." End of quote. And I really hope that's going to happen, right? I think the European countries have lost their strategic autonomy for a long time, right? They're just really wagging their tails, behind the United States. I think it's time for them to have a wake-up call. So it is frustrating to still hear some politicians say, US, please don't target us, target China. That is our kind of common enemy. I think it's just so unbelievable if they're still having the kinds of rhetoric, right? The US has already abandoned them. They need to find their own way out. They need to work with China and other countries for that matter. Instead of begging the US to turn back, which is not going to happen. So I think, same revelation that comes from Canada, to understand, the world has moved on and they have to do so as well. And so I'm actually, I think that is a silver lining that, we have the opportunity to build a better world.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. This was very, very good. The wake up call was I felt it this morning when all European leaders were out on emergency press conferences, because this is much bigger than what the disappointment with Trump dealing with Putin and Ukraine. This is much bigger, I guess, because it
Mhm.
has to do. This is not a question of ideology. That we have the ideology of zero-sum game, and imperial geopolitics has to be abandoned, and there should be a completely new the way of thinking, a way of thinking which works and has been proven to work. This idea of win-win and a community of a shared future for mankind. This is not simply rhetoric of nice talk. This has been implemented on the ground, and it's giving enormous positive results to not only China, but all its partners in Asia and Africa and so on. So this is something which we people need to think about, and especially here in the EU. So I thank you very much for all the enlightening words and also all the information you have shared with us. If you have any final thoughts, we promise, of course, our viewers to have another discussion with you on the question of financial sustainability within the Belt and Road Initiative, especially the question of financing infrastructure projects. There was a lot of talk about that, debt trap, debt sustainability, but we can have this, I hope, soon in in another episode. So if you have anything, final words, you are welcome to share with us.
Not really. I think we've covered the major grounds, but I do look forward to our next discussion because I think, you know, Donald Trump has already got enough oxygen, got enough attention. We need to move away, from he being the one who leads the agenda. So I think we need to go back to talk about more constructive, more positive changes in the world that we're seeing. And I think I agree with you. China definitely serves a different, model, right? That we could see, we can look towards, and we can aspire to expand that. And I know that you have already done a lot of amazing work on debunking, that diplomacy, the so-called that trap diplomacy. And so I'm really looking forward to, sort of picking your brain, and we can talk through this and, really how to sort of relieve the current sort of that crises that many countries are facing. So I look forward to that.
Thank you very much, Professor Yan Liang from Oregon, the United States. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights with us. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Bye.